October 23, 1972. São Paulo, Brazil. Brazilian federal police moved through the city in coordinated raids, targeting members of an international heroin trafficking network. Among those arrested was a man using various aliases, sometimes Manuel Lopez Cadena, sometimes Adalberto Barbieri. He bought bread at the same bakeries each morning, nodded to the same shopkeepers, lived quietly in apartments that revealed nothing about who he really was. When police confirmed his identity through fingerprints sent from Rome, the name that emerged was Tommaso Buscetta, and he was one of the most wanted men in Sicily. He had crossed an ocean to continue his criminal operations, but the distance wasn't far enough. This arrest wouldn't break him. He remained loyal to Cosa Nostra, was extradited to Italy, served time, and was released. But it established a pattern that would define the next decade. Brazil as a haven for Italian organized crime, and the slow, patient work of international law enforcement to penetrate that sanctuary. The question wasn't whether the Mafia could hide in Brazil. They'd been doing it for years. The question was how long they could survive before geography stopped protecting them. When organized crime needs to vanish, geography becomes survival. In the 1970s and 80s, as Italian law enforcement modernized and international cooperation increased, members of Cosa Nostra, the Camorra, and the 'Ndrangheta faced a calculation: prison in Italy or exile in a country where Italian investigators had limited reach. Brazil offered what few other nations could: vast territory where a man could blend into rural communities or urban immigrant neighborhoods, weak extradition laws that made it difficult for Italy to reclaim fugitives, and a level of corruption that, properly managed, could keep authorities looking the other way. The country stretched from the Amazon to the Pampas, 5,000 miles of coastline and interior wilderness, where a fugitive could become a farmer, a businessman, or simply another immigrant trying to build a life. Brazil had welcomed Italian migration since the 19th century, establishing communities where Sicilian dialects were still spoken, where old world customs persisted, where a man from Palermo or Naples could arrive and find instant familiarity. This infrastructure of diaspora, combined with Brazil's distance from European law enforcement, made it the logical destination for mobsters who needed to disappear. But exile was never freedom. The men who fled to Brazil carried their paranoia with them, understanding that distance didn't erase their crimes or protect them from rivals who might follow. They lived under false names, avoided cameras, trusted no one completely, and always kept an exit strategy. Some lasted decades. Others were caught within years, and a few never left, dying in Brazilian soil far from the Sicilian villages or Neapolitan streets where they'd built their criminal empires. Their stories reveal the human cost of fugitive life: the isolation, the constant fear, the slow erosion of identity that comes from living as someone else. These weren't romantic adventures in tropical hideaways. They were extended sentences of psychological imprisonment, traded for physical freedom, where every knock on the door could mean extradition, and every new face could be an informant. Tommaso Buscetta was born on July 13, 1928, in Palermo, Sicily, in the neighborhood of Porta Nuova. By his 20s, he'd been inducted into Cosa Nostra, rising through the ranks during Sicily's post-war criminal restructuring. Buscetta was intelligent, diplomatic, skilled at mediating disputes between families, qualities that made him valuable to the organization and dangerous to its enemies. He worked with various factions initially, but as Cosa Nostra descended into the first Mafia war in the early 1960s, Buscetta found himself navigating increasingly dangerous territory. The war, which ended roughly in 1963, left the organization fractured and suspicious. By 1970, facing legal troubles in the aftermath of that conflict, Buscetta fled to Brazil. His first exile lasted until 1972, when Brazilian federal police, working with Italian authorities, arrested him as part of a massive crackdown on an international heroin trafficking ring. Buscetta had been using multiple aliases, Manuel Lopez Cadena, Adalberto Barbieri, and operating within São Paulo's criminal networks. He was extradited to Italy, prosecuted, and imprisoned. But critically, he did not cooperate. He remained a loyal member of Cosa Nostra, serving his sentence and maintaining omertà. When he was released in 1980, Buscetta faced a Sicily that was about to descend into something far worse than the conflict he'd fled a decade earlier. The Second Mafia War was beginning. Between 1981 and 1984, Salvatore Riina and the Corleonese faction would systematically eliminate their rivals in what became known as the Matanza, the slaughter. This wasn't political maneuvering or targeted hits against leadership. It was wholesale extermination of entire families, including women and children, anyone connected to Riina's enemies. Buscetta, recognizing the signs of impending catastrophe, fled to Brazil again in early 1981, just before the violence exploded. This time he settled in Rio de Janeiro, using a new identity that would become his most famous alias, Roberto Cavalcanti. As Roberto Cavalcanti, Buscetta established himself in Rio's affluent neighborhoods, living in a luxury villa in Alto da Boa Vista, a mountainous area overlooking the city. He married a Brazilian woman named Cristina, integrated into expatriate Italian society, and presented himself as a successful businessman. His neighbors knew him as Roberto, a cultured Italian with resources and connections. What they didn't know was that back in Sicily, the Corleonesi were systematically murdering his family. Between 1981 and 1982, Buscetta's two sons, his brother, his son-in-law, and several nephews were killed by Riina's gunmen. The message was clear. There was no neutrality, no retirement, no safety even across an ocean. The murders reached into Brazil not physically but psychologically, destroying everything Buscetta had built. Italian authorities hadn't forgotten him. Despite his new identity as Roberto Cavalcanti, surveillance continued. On October 23, 1983, 11 years to the day after his first arrest, Brazilian federal police arrived in São Paulo at his home in the Brooklyn neighborhood. Buscetta was arrested, this time with no possibility of return to his Brazilian life. Facing extradition and understanding that the organization he'd served had murdered his family, Buscetta attempted suicide in his cell, swallowing strychnine. He survived, and in that survival, something broke. In 1984, Buscetta made the decision that would change Mafia history forever. He agreed to cooperate with Italian prosecutors, becoming the highest-ranking Cosa Nostra member ever to break omertà. His testimony, delivered to Judge Giovanni Falcone, provided unprecedented insight into Mafia structure, operations, and membership. Buscetta's revelations led to the Maxi trial in Palermo, where 475 defendants were prosecuted and 342 were convicted. The trial, held in a specially constructed bunker courthouse, marked the Italian government's most successful assault on Cosa Nostra. Why did Buscetta break the code of silence? His explanation was simple. The Mafia he'd known no longer existed. Salvatore Riina and the Corleonesi had destroyed the old rules, murdering women and children, eliminating entire families, turning Cosa Nostra into something unrecognizable. Buscetta didn't see his testimony as betrayal. He saw it as exposing men who'd already betrayed everything the Mafia claimed to represent. Whether this rationalization was genuine or self-serving remains debated, but the practical result was undeniable. Buscetta's cooperation, stemming from his Brazilian exile and the murders of his family during that exile, devastated Cosa Nostra's leadership and provided the template for other pentiti who followed his example. His years in Brazil, first in the early 70s, then from 1981 to 1983, revealed the fundamental vulnerability of fugitive life. Distance provides temporary safety, but it doesn't erase the past or protect against determined law enforcement. Buscetta had tried to disappear into Brazil's immigrant communities, to become Manuel Lopez Cadena or Roberto Cavalcanti or whatever name he chose, but his identity couldn't be erased. The Mafia wars that drove him into exile followed him across the Atlantic, not through hitmen, but through the murders of his family and through international cooperation between Italian authorities and Brazilian police. And when he finally broke omerta, it was from Brazilian custody, making his exile the launching point for the greatest betrayal in Mafia history. While Buscetta's case became legendary, other Italian fugitives were building longer-lasting hideouts in Brazil's interior, far from São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, in places where Italian communities were smaller, but foreign scrutiny was even more limited. Pasquale Scotti belonged to the Nuova Camorra Organizzata, the criminal syndicate that controlled Naples and its surrounding regions in the 1970s and 80s. The Camorra wasn't Cosa Nostra. It lacked the formal structure and commission that governed the Sicilian Mafia, but it was equally violent and far more fragmented, with dozens of clans competing for control of drug trafficking, extortion, and smuggling operations. Scotti was a soldier in this organization, implicated in murders and racketeering as the NCO fought brutal wars against rival clans. In 1986, facing arrest warrants that would have sent him to prison for life, Scotti fled Italy. He didn't go to São Paulo or Rio, cities with established Italian communities but also police presence and surveillance. Instead, he went northeast to Recife, the capital of Pernambuco state. Recife sits on Brazil's Atlantic coast, far from the southern regions where Italian immigration had concentrated. It was a strategic choice. Fewer Italian connections meant fewer people who might recognize him, and northeastern Brazil's relationship with European law enforcement was minimal. Scotti arrived with a new identity: Francisco de Castro Visconti. The name suggested Portuguese heritage, fitting naturally into Brazil's cultural landscape. He settled into a modest life, avoiding flashy displays of wealth that might attract attention. For 29 years, Scotti lived as Francisco de Castro. He married a Brazilian woman, established himself in the local community, maintained a low profile that suggested respectability without prominence. He worked in legitimate businesses, paid his taxes, participated in neighborhood life. The perfect cover for a man trying to become invisible. The psychological endurance required for this is difficult to comprehend. Every interaction carried risk. Every conversation might include a detail that didn't match his fabricated past. Every news report from Italy about Camorra arrests was a reminder that his real identity could resurface at any moment. Yet Scotti maintained the illusion, year after year, as Italy's justice system continued seeking him, as his former associates were arrested or killed, as the NCO itself was dismantled by law enforcement. But technology was changing. In the 1980s, international police cooperation was limited by communication barriers and competing priorities. By the 2000s, Interpol had established sophisticated databases, biometric identification was standard, and Italian prosecutors were dedicating resources to tracking fugitives wherever they'd fled. In 2015, acting on intelligence that Scotti was in Brazil, Italian authorities worked with Brazilian federal police to locate him. The arrest came on August 20th, 2015, at his home in Recife. Scotti was 68 years old, living under his false name, married, embedded in the community. When police arrived with photographs from the 1980s and fingerprint records proving Francisco de Castro was actually Pasquale Scotti, his 3-decade fugitive existence collapsed in minutes. The arrest revealed the extent of his integration. Neighbors were shocked. Francisco had been a quiet, unremarkable presence for nearly 30 years. His wife may or may not have known his real identity. Sources differ on whether Scotti had confided in her or maintained the deception even in his closest relationship. But the facade he'd constructed was complete enough to survive 29 years of daily life, suggesting either extraordinary discipline or the psychological compartmentalization that allows someone to genuinely become the person they're pretending to be. Scotti fought extradition fiercely, appealing through Brazil's complex legal system. The battle lasted months, reaching Brazil's Supreme Court before he was finally returned to Italy in March 2016. He faced prosecution for murders and criminal association charges dating back to the 1980s. The legal process dragged on. Evidence was old, witnesses had died or disappeared, and defense attorneys argued that the decades-long delay violated due process. But the Italian justice system was determined to demonstrate that time and distance didn't erase accountability. Scotti's case illustrated a pattern that would repeat with other fugitives. Brazil offered long-term sanctuary, but not permanent safety. The country's vastness and cultural diversity allowed fugitives to disappear into communities that wouldn't question their origins. But as international law enforcement cooperation improved, as databases linked scattered information, as Interpol and bilateral agreements made extradition easier, Brazil's protection eroded. The same geography that had made it attractive for hiding, remote regions, weak local enforcement, corruption, also made it vulnerable to coordinated international operations. When Italian prosecutors decided to prioritize a fugitive's capture, Brazilian authorities increasingly cooperated, understanding that harboring international criminals damaged their country's reputation and relationships with European allies. The 'Ndrangheta, Calabria's organized crime syndicate, had also discovered Brazil's utility as a fugitive haven. Unlike the fragmented Camorra or the hierarchical Cosa Nostra, the 'Ndrangheta was structured around family blood ties, making infiltration by law enforcement extremely difficult. By the 1990s, it had become Europe's most powerful criminal organization, controlling an estimated 80% of cocaine entering the continent. This dominance was built on South American connections. The 'Ndrangheta established direct relationships with Colombian and Brazilian cartels, eliminating intermediaries and maximizing profits. These business relationships made Brazil a natural destination for 'Ndrangheta fugitives, who could leverage existing drug trafficking networks to support their exile. Rocco Morabito was one of the 'Ndrangheta's most important figures, specializing in cocaine importation from South America to Europe. Born in 1966 in Africa, Calabria, Morabito rose through the ranks of his clan, establishing himself as a crucial link between South American suppliers and European distribution networks. Italian authorities identified him as a major cocaine trafficker in the 1990s, issuing arrest warrants that sent him underground. Morabito fled to South America, specifically Uruguay, where he lived for years under the alias Francisco Antonio Capelletto. Uruguay, like Brazil, offered weak extradition enforcement and a comfortable lifestyle for criminals with resources. Morabito established himself in Montevideo's Italian community, maintaining his drug trafficking operations while presenting himself as a legitimate businessman. But on September 4th, 2017, Uruguayan police, acting on Italian intelligence, raided a luxury hotel in Montevideo where Morabito was staying. He was arrested, and the extradition process began. However, Morabito didn't remain in custody long. On June 23, 2019, he escaped from Montevideo's central prison through a tunnel, a spectacular jailbreak that revealed either corruption within the prison system or extraordinary planning by his organization. Morabito vanished, and authorities assumed he'd fled deeper into South America, possibly returning to Brazil, where Ndrangheta operations were concentrated. They were correct. For nearly 2 years, Morabito evaded capture, moving through South America's criminal underworld, supported by drug trafficking networks that owed him loyalty. Italian and Brazilian authorities continued searching, using informants, surveillance, and financial tracking to locate him. The breakthrough came in May 2021. Acting on intelligence that Morabito was in northeastern Brazil, Brazilian federal police launched Operation Tarantella, coordinating with Italian authorities and Interpol. On May 24, 2021, they raided a hotel in João Pessoa, capital of Paraíba State. Morabito was arrested along with another fugitive Ndrangheta member, Vincenzo Pasquino. The operation was meticulously planned, involving months of surveillance and coordination across multiple countries. When police entered the hotel room, they found Morabito living cautiously, with multiple escape routes prepared and substantial cash reserves. His arrest was significant not just because of his role in cocaine trafficking, but because it demonstrated the Ndrangheta's use of Brazil as a strategic base. Morabito wasn't hiding in isolation. He was operating, maintaining his position in drug networks, coordinating shipments, managing finances. Brazil wasn't just refuge, it was infrastructure. The Ndrangheta's cocaine operations required presence in South American source countries, and fugitive status didn't prevent senior members from continuing their work. This was organized crime's evolution. Fugitives weren't passive exiles waiting out their sentences. They were active participants in transnational criminal enterprises, using their South American presence to strengthen European operations. Vincenzo Macri represented another dimension of Ndrangheta flight to South America, a boss in the Commisso clan based in Siderno, Calabria. Macri fled Italy to avoid prosecution for Mafia association and other charges. Unlike Morabito, who established himself in Uruguay, Macri moved between several countries, Venezuela, Colombia, and eventually Brazil. This mobility was strategic, making him harder to track while maintaining access to cocaine sources and trafficking routes. But mobility also created vulnerability. Each border crossing, each new identity, each interaction with authorities presented risk. On June 9, 2017, Brazilian federal police arrested Macri at São Paulo's Guarulhos International Airport as he attempted to board a flight to Caracas, Venezuela. He was traveling under a false identity, trying to continue his pattern of constant movement that had kept him free for years. The arrest resulted from intelligence sharing between Italian and Brazilian authorities, who'd been tracking Macri's movements for months. His capture revealed the increasing sophistication of international law enforcement. Fugitives could no longer simply cross borders and disappear. Their financial transactions, travel patterns, and communication were monitored, analyzed, and eventually used to coordinate arrests. Macri's extradition to Italy followed the now familiar pattern. Lengthy legal battles as defense attorneys argued against transfer, diplomatic pressure from Italian prosecutors determined to bring him home, and eventual compliance by Brazilian courts that recognized the legitimacy of Italian warrants. By June 2018, Macri was back in Italy facing trial for his role in 'Ndrangheta operations. His time in South America had lasted years, but like Scotti and Morabito before him, distance and false identity hadn't provided permanent escape, only delayed accountability. The question that emerges from these cases is fundamental. Why did Brazil attract so many Italian organized crime fugitives? The answer lies in a combination of geography, culture, law, and corruption. Geographically, Brazil's size, it's the world's fifth largest country by area, provided endless hiding places. A fugitive could disappear into the Amazon, settle in northeastern beach towns, or blend into Sao Paulo's millions. Cultural factors mattered equally. Brazil has the largest Italian diaspora outside Italy. Approximately 30 million Brazilians claim Italian ancestry, concentrated in the south and southeast. Italian clubs, restaurants, churches, and cultural organizations created communities where Sicilian or Neapolitan accents didn't raise suspicion. Fugitives could find people who spoke their dialects, understood their cultural references, and asked no questions about their pasts. Legally, Brazil's extradition framework before the 2000s was weak. The country's constitution prohibited extradition of Brazilian citizens, and naturalization was relatively accessible. Some fugitives obtained Brazilian citizenship through marriage or residency, complicating extradition proceedings. Even when extradition was legally possible, the process took years, during which fugitives could remain free on bail or appeal endlessly through Brazilian courts. Scotti's case exemplified this. Arrested in August 2015, he fought extradition through Brazil's Supreme Court and wasn't returned to Italy until March 2016. This legal complexity bought time, months or years when fugitives could continue living under their false identities, building deeper roots in Brazilian society, making eventual extraction more difficult. Corruption was the final factor, though its extent varied by region and decade. In rural areas and smaller cities, local police could be paid to ignore certain residents or provide advance warning of federal operations. Brazilian federal police were generally professional and committed to cooperation with international partners. But municipal and state police operated with less oversight and more susceptibility to bribery. For a fugitive with resources, maintaining good relationships with local authorities wasn't difficult. Regular payments, respect for local power structures, and avoiding crimes that would draw attention created a sustainable arrangement. This corruption wasn't unique to Brazil, it characterized much of Latin America. But Brazil's size and immigrant communities made it particularly attractive. Yet every advantage Brazil offered had a corresponding limitation. The size that provided hiding places also made fugitives dependent on local support networks that could be infiltrated or turned. The Italian communities that offered cultural camouflage also created concentrations that Italian investigators knew to monitor. The weak extradition framework was strengthening as Brazil modernized its legal system and sought better relationships with European partners. And corruption, while useful to fugitives, was unpredictable. Arrangements could collapse when political winds shifted, or federal authorities decided to crack down on local complicity. The fugitives themselves adapted to these realities with varying success. Buscetta had tried twice to establish himself in Brazil, arrested both times and ultimately cooperating with authorities after the murders of his family during the Second Mafia War. Scotti had succeeded for 29 years by choosing Recife, avoiding the Italian communities where recognition was more likely, and maintaining absolute discipline in his false identity as Francisco de Castro. Morabito had used Uruguay and Brazil as operational bases rather than pure hiding spots. continuing his cocaine trafficking work while nominally fugitive. But his mobility and continued criminal activity also made him easier to track. And McCree had moved constantly between Venezuela, Colombia, and Brazil, treating South America as a region rather than a country, understanding that static positions made capture easier, but eventually being caught at an airport as he tried to maintain that mobility. Their experiences revealed patterns that law enforcement exploited. Fugitives needed money, requiring either financial transfers from Italy that could be traced or local criminal activity that drew attention. They needed communication with family and associates, creating digital and physical trails. They needed healthcare documentation, and eventually, as they aged, stability that made mobility harder. Each of these needs created vulnerabilities. Italian investigators working with Brazilian federal police and Interpol learned to identify these patterns, using them to narrow search areas and coordinate arrests. The arrests themselves were increasingly sophisticated operations. When Brazilian federal police arrested Scotti in 2015, they didn't simply show up at his door. They had conducted months of surveillance confirming his identity through photographs and eventually biometric analysis. They'd monitored his routines, identified his associates, ensured he had no warning before the arrest. The same approach characterized Morabito's capture in 2021. Operation Tarantella involved multiple countries, dozens of investigators, and careful planning to ensure Morabito couldn't escape again. This level of international cooperation was unthinkable in the 1970s when Buscetta first fled to Brazil. By the 2010s, it was standard practice, transforming fugitive hunting from national police work to coordinated transnational operations. The human cost of fugitive life emerged most clearly in the aftermath of arrests. Scotti had lived as Francisco de Castro for nearly 3 decades, long enough that his false identity had become more real than his original one. When arrested, he was torn not just from his geographical location, but from the life he'd constructed. The marriage, the friendships, the daily routines that had sustained him for 29 years. His wife and neighbors described shock and disbelief, suggesting Scotti had succeeded in becoming Francisco to such an extent that those around him genuinely believed the fiction. This psychological transformation, the necessity of living so completely in a false identity that it supplants the real one, represents a form of self-erasure. Scotti left Italy as a Camorra soldier and became a Brazilian civilian, only to be arrested and forced to revert to an identity he'd spent 3 decades suppressing. Morabito's case illustrated a different psychological reality. Unlike Scotti, who tried to disappear into civilian life, Morabito remained operationally active, continuing his cocaine trafficking work from exile. His escape from Uruguayan prison and subsequent 2-year evasion demonstrated commitment to remaining free at all costs. But that freedom was constrained. He couldn't return to Italy, couldn't see family except through clandestine visits, couldn't live openly or without constant security measures. The hotel room in João Pessoa where he was finally arrested had been chosen for its security and escape routes, revealing his awareness that capture was always imminent. This is fugitive life's paradox: physical freedom purchased through psychological imprisonment, where every day brings the possibility that law enforcement will end the carefully maintained illusion. The broader implications of these cases extend beyond individual fugitives to organized crime strategic adaptation. When Buscetta fled to Brazil in 1970, it was relatively unusual. Most Mafia fugitives stayed in Italy, hiding in Sicily's interior or other regions where family connections provided protection. By the 1980s and 90s, international flight had become standard practice, for high-ranking criminals facing serious charges. This shift reflected both increased law enforcement effectiveness within Italy and improved international mobility. Fugitives could obtain false documents, board international flights, and establish themselves in foreign countries more easily than previous generations. But it also reflected organized crime's globalization. The 'Ndrangheta's dominance of European cocaine trafficking required South American presence, making fugitive status in Brazil or Uruguay not just refuge but strategic positioning. Law enforcement adapted in response. Italian prosecutors developed specialized units focused on tracking international fugitives, coordinating with Interpol and foreign police agencies. The Direzione Investigativa Anti-Mafia, Italy's anti-mafia investigative agency, maintained databases of fugitives, tracked their potential locations, and prioritized captures based on criminal significance. Brazilian federal police, initially reluctant to invest resources in capturing foreign criminals, increasingly cooperated as they recognized that Italian organized crime was establishing operations within Brazil. The 'Ndrangheta's cocaine trafficking routes through Brazilian ports directly threatened Brazilian security, making fugitive arrests beneficial to Brazilian interests as well as Italian ones. This evolution in law enforcement strategy had practical effects. In the early 1970s, Buscetta could live openly in Sao Paulo for 2 years before his first arrest. In the 1980s, Scotti could disappear into Recife and remain undetected for nearly 3 decades. But by the 2010s, the combination of biometric databases, surveillance technology, financial tracking, and international cooperation made long-term evasion far more difficult. Morabito's capture in 2021 came after sophisticated intelligence operations tracked his financial movements and communications, narrowing his location to João Pessoa and allowing coordinated arrests. The window for successful long-term fugitive existence was closing, not because fugitives had become less careful, but because the tools available to track them had become exponentially more powerful. Yet some fugitives remain at large. Despite decades of investigation and multiple arrest attempts, certain high-ranking Italian organized crime figures continue evading capture, presumably in South America or elsewhere. Their continued evasion suggests either extraordinary operational security, corruption at levels sufficient to warn them before arrests, or locations so remote that standard investigative techniques cannot reach them. The Brazilian Amazon, for instance, contains communities accessible only by boat or plane, where federal authority is nominal and local power structures operate independently. A fugitive with resources and local connections could theoretically disappear into these regions, living beyond effective law enforcement reach. Whether any actually have is unknown, but the possibility demonstrates that Brazil's vastness still provides opportunities for those willing to accept complete isolation. The enduring question raised by these cases is philosophical. What drives someone to spend decades in hiding rather than facing prosecution? The practical answer involves sentencing. Italian courts impose lengthy sentences for mafia crimes, meaning capture likely meant dying in prison. The psychological answer is more complex. For men like Scotti, who'd constructed entire lives in Brazil, returning to face Italian justice meant not just imprisonment, but the loss of everything they'd built during exile. The years spent as Francisco de Castro weren't just hiding. They were living, forming relationships, establishing identity. Surrendering voluntarily would have meant admitting that those decades were a lie, that Francisco de Castro never existed, that every relationship was built on deception. The psychological burden of that admission might have been unbearable, making continued evasion preferable even as the risk of capture increased. For men like Morabito, who remained operationally active in criminal enterprises, the calculation was different. Surrender meant not just personal imprisonment, but disruption of lucrative operations. The Ndrangheta's cocaine trafficking generated hundreds of millions of euros annually, and senior figures like Morabito received substantial shares. Beyond the money, there was status. Being a wanted fugitive who continued operating despite international manhunts carried a certain prestige within criminal circles, demonstrating competence and resilience that enhanced reputation. Capture represented not just legal consequences, but professional failure, admission that law enforcement had won. The families left behind in Italy experienced their own form of imprisonment. Wives, children, parents of fugitives lived under surveillance, their communications monitored, their movements tracked, all in the hope that they would lead investigators to their fugitive relatives. Some maintained contact through clandestine means, intermediaries, coded messages, brief meetings in neutral countries. Others severed connections entirely, recognizing that association with fugitives made normal life impossible. The Italian state's strategy of pressuring families to cooperate or cutting them off from assets seized from fugitives created moral dilemmas. Maintain family loyalty at the cost of personal freedom, or cooperate with authorities and live with the stigma of betrayal. Children of fugitives grew up with absent fathers, often learning only years later why. Some were told their fathers had died or disappeared. Others understood from young ages that their fathers were criminals in hiding. The psychological impact of these revelations, understanding that your father was not the person you thought, that your family history was constructed deception, created trauma that extended across generations. When Scotti was arrested in 2015, questions immediately arose about his Brazilian family. Had his wife known? Had he told his children? The answers remained private, but the human cost of maintaining such deception for 29 years, the lies told daily, the constant vigilance against exposure must have been enormous. Brazilian society itself paid costs for serving as a fugitive haven. The presence of Italian organized crime figures in Brazilian cities and rural areas brought violence, corruption, and criminal infrastructure that affected local communities. While fugitives generally avoided drawing attention through local crimes, their presence often meant establishing relationships with Brazilian criminal organizations, sharing knowledge and resources, and occasionally engaging in operations that victimize Brazilian citizens. The Ndrangheta's cocaine trafficking through Brazilian ports involved corruption of port officials, law enforcement, and customs agents, weakening institutions and enabling broader criminal activity. Fugitives' willingness to pay bribes created markets for corruption that extended beyond their individual cases. The arrests, when they finally came, brought media circuses that disrupted communities. Scotti's capture in Recife generated intense Brazilian and Italian press coverage, with reporters descending on his neighborhood, interviewing neighbors, dissecting his 3-decade deception. For a community that had known him as Francisco, the revelation that he was actually a fugitive Camorra member brought shock, betrayal, and questions about who else might be hiding among them. The spectacle of Italian prosecutors arriving to extradite someone who'd lived peacefully for nearly 30 years raised uncomfortable questions about justice, rehabilitation, and whether decades-old crimes still warranted prosecution when the perpetrator had apparently reformed and integrated into law-abiding society. These philosophical questions divided public opinion in both Italy and Brazil. Italian prosecutors argued that justice has no statute of limitations for serious crimes, that Scotti's years in Brazil were stolen time rather than rehabilitation, that victims and survivors deserved closure through prosecution. Brazilian commentators sometimes countered that Francisco de Castro had committed no crimes in Brazil, had lived peacefully for 3 decades, and that extraditing an elderly man to face decades-old charges seemed vindictive rather than just. The legal reality, that Italian warrants were valid and extradition treaties obligated compliance, overrode these debates, but they revealed tensions about international criminal justice and whether punishment or rehabilitation should be the primary goal. The technical aspects of these arrests demonstrated law enforcement's evolution. When Brazilian federal police arrested Scotti in 2015, they used biometric facial recognition software to confirm his identity, comparing current photographs against images from the 1980s. The technology had advanced sufficiently to recognize individuals despite aging, weight changes, and decades of time. When Morabito was captured in 2021, investigators had used financial tracking software to identify suspicious transactions, communications analysis to map his network, and surveillance to confirm his location. These tools, unimaginable in the 1970s, made long-term evasion dependent not just on hiding, but on avoiding any interaction with modern systems, banking, telecommunications, healthcare, that generated digital records. Yet the most sophisticated technology couldn't replace human intelligence. Every major arrest involved informants, people within criminal organizations or Brazilian communities who provided information to authorities. Morabito's capture in João Pessoa came after tips from sources within the Ndrangheta, suggesting internal betrayals or law enforcement infiltration. Scotti's arrest in Recife followed similar patterns, with intelligence pointing authorities to his specific location after years of searching. This reliance on human sources meant that fugitive success depended on maintaining absolute trust within small circles. The moment someone decided to cooperate, whether for money, immunity, or revenge, the fugitive's location became known. The paranoia this created was itself a form of imprisonment, requiring constant evaluation of who could be trusted and whether today would be the day someone betrayed you. The legal proceedings following arrests were often anticlimactic compared to the drama of fugitive life and capture. Extradition hearings involved technical arguments about treaty obligations, due process, and whether conditions in Italian prisons met human rights standards. Defense attorneys argued that clients had been rehabilitated by their years in Brazil, that Italian evidence was too old to be reliable, that their clients faced persecution rather than prosecution. Brazilian judges generally ruled in favor of extradition, recognizing that denying valid warrants would damage international cooperation and suggest Brazil condoned criminal safe havens. But the process took months or years, during which fugitives remained in Brazilian custody, facing the slow grinding of legal machinery that would eventually return them to Italy. Upon returning to Italy, fugitives faced prosecution for decades-old crimes. Evidence had to be reconstructed from old files, witnesses located and convinced to testify, and legal standards from the time of the crimes applied to current proceedings. Some cases resulted in convictions and lengthy sentences. Others collapsed when evidence proved insufficient or witnesses recanted. But the Italian justice system's determination to prosecute, regardless of time elapsed, sent a message. Fleeing to Brazil or anywhere else only delayed consequences. It didn't erase them. This deterrent effect was intentional. Italian prosecutors wanted organized crime members to understand that becoming fugitives meant spending the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders, never secure, always vulnerable to arrest. The countries that hosted fugitives experienced their own reckonings. Brazil's reputation as a safe haven damaged its international standing, suggesting to European partners that Brazilian authorities either couldn't or wouldn't control their territory. As Brazil sought closer economic and political ties with Europe in the 21st century, harboring Italian fugitives became diplomatically costly. Brazilian presidents and justice ministers increasingly emphasized cooperation with international law enforcement, demonstrating that Brazil was a responsible partner rather than a criminal sanctuary. The arrests of Scotti, Morabito, and Macri served Brazilian interests by showing European allies that their requests for assistance would be honored. But cooperation had limits. Brazilian sovereignty meant that Italian authorities couldn't operate independently within Brazil. Every investigation, surveillance operation, and arrest required Brazilian authorization and participation. This created friction when Italian prosecutors wanted immediate action, and Brazilian authorities insisted on proper legal process. The balance between respecting sovereignty and enabling international justice remained contentious, with each arrest representing a negotiation between competing national interests. Brazil wanted to maintain its reputation for respecting due process and human rights, while also demonstrating reliability to international partners. Italian prosecutors wanted fugitives captured quickly and returned for trial, with minimal legal obstacles. These tensions played out in courtrooms and diplomatic channels, with fugitives caught in the middle. The cultural dimension of Italian presence in Brazil added complexity. Italian-Brazilian communities sometimes viewed fugitives with ambivalence. They were criminals, certainly, but they were also fellow Italians facing persecution by a government that historically hadn't always treated Southern Italians fairly. This cultural loyalty created social pressure against cooperation with authorities, making investigations harder when communities closed ranks around fugitives. Brazilian authorities had to navigate these dynamics carefully, understanding that aggressive operations in Italian neighborhoods could create backlash and accusations of ethnic profiling. The result was often careful, patient investigation that took years, but eventually succeeded without alienating communities. The environmental settings where fugitives hid became part of their stories. Recife, where Scotti lived, is a coastal city known for beaches, colonial architecture, and vibrant culture. It's tropical, hot year-round, far from the European climate fugitives had known. Adapting to this environment, the heat, the food, the social customs required flexibility and willingness to embrace Brazilian life fully. Scotti apparently succeeded, becoming Francisco so completely that he integrated into Recife's social fabric. João Pessoa, where Morabito was captured, is smaller and quieter, a beach town where hotels overlook the Atlantic. Rio de Janeiro's Alto da Boa Vista, where Buscetta lived as Roberto Cavalcanti, offered mountain views and wealthy seclusion. The contrast between these peaceful settings and the fugitives' violent pasts created cognitive dissonance. How could men responsible for murders and drug trafficking live quietly in Brazilian beach towns and mountain villas, apparently at peace? The answer is that place doesn't change identity. It only masks it. Scotti could live in Recife as Francisco, but he remained Pasquale underneath, carrying memories and knowledge of his Camorra past. Morabito could enjoy João Pessoa's beaches, but he remained an Ndrangheta boss, maintaining criminal operations despite his fugitive status. Buscetta could live in Rio as Roberto Cavalcanti, married to Cristina, but he remained Tommaso, and when the Corleonesi murdered his family, that identity reasserted itself catastrophically. The Brazilian landscape provided backdrop, not transformation. And when arrests came, the peaceful settings became crime scenes with police cars and helicopters disrupting the tropical tranquility, revealing that fugitives had been hiding in plain sight all along. As the 21st century progressed, the era of long-term fugitive success in Brazil effectively ended. The combination of technology, international cooperation, and Brazilian willingness to participate in captures meant that new fugitives couldn't expect decades of freedom the way Scotti had achieved in the 1980s. By 2020, any Italian organized crime figure fleeing to Brazil understood that they were buying time, not permanent escape. This changed the calculus. Was 5 or 10 years of freedom and exile worth the eventual capture and extradition? For some, apparently yes. For others, the declining returns made fighting charges in Italy seem preferable to fugitive life in Brazil. The COVID-19 pandemic added another dimension. International travel restrictions made fleeing to Brazil more difficult, and fugitives already there found themselves trapped in a different way. Unable to move easily between countries, more dependent on local support networks, more vulnerable to surveillance that had increased during pandemic lockdowns. Brazilian federal police used pandemic-era surveillance systems to track fugitives, achieving arrests that might have been harder in normal times when international movement was less restricted and monitored. The Buscetta precedent, cooperation leading to witness protection and reduced sentences, created an alternative that some fugitives eventually chose. Rather than spending decades in Brazilian exile followed by arrest and full prosecution, cooperation offered the possibility of reduced sentences and protection for families. The Italian state increasingly offered deals to fugitives willing to provide testimony, recognizing that insider information could dismantle organizations more effectively than arresting individuals. This created tension within the Mafia, Camorra, and 'Ndrangheta. Fugitives in Brazil, facing capture, might decide that cooperation was preferable to prison, leading to cascading betrayals that devastated criminal organizations. The possibility that any fugitive might break omertà made trust more difficult and organizations more paranoid. The stories of these fugitives, Buscetta, Scotti, Morabito, Macri, and others less well known, reveal the limits of geography as protection. Brazil offered distance, cultural camouflage, weak enforcement, and corruption, all advantages for men trying to disappear. But every advantage was temporary, eroding as technology advanced, international cooperation strengthened, and Brazilian authorities prioritized compliance with European partners. The fugitives who succeeded for decades did so through extraordinary discipline, intelligence, and luck, maintaining false identities so completely that they became real, avoiding attention that would trigger investigation, choosing locations remote enough to be overlooked, but connected enough to maintain normal lives. And even they were eventually caught, demonstrating that fugitive life in Brazil was postponement rather than escape. The human cost emerges most clearly in the aftermath. Scotti lost 29 years to exile, living as someone else, building a life based on deception. When arrested, he lost both the freedom his exile had provided and the identity he'd constructed, returned to Italy as an old man facing prosecution for crimes from his youth. Morabito spent decades evading capture, escaping from prison, constantly moving, unable to live openly or peacefully. His life was defined by evasion, and when finally captured, he faced the remainder of his years in Italian prison, his cocaine empire dismantled. Buscetta lost his family to the Second Mafia War while hiding in Brazil, fled twice, was arrested both times, and ultimately betrayed everyone he'd known in exchange for survival. None of these outcomes suggest success. They're variations on imprisonment, physical or psychological, immediate or delayed. The landscapes themselves remain: the beaches of Recife where Scotti walked as Francisco, the hotel in João Pessoa where Morabito was captured alongside Vincenzo Pasquino, the luxury villa in Rio's Alto da Boa Vista where Buscetta lived as Roberto Cavalcanti before his world collapsed. These places continue indifferent to the dramas that unfolded within them, hosting new residents who know nothing of the fugitives who once hid there. This is geography's fundamental quality. It outlasts the people who use it, providing stage sets for human stories but offering no judgment or memory. Brazil was a haven because it was vast, distant, and indifferent. It stopped being a haven when that indifference gave way to cooperation with authorities who refused to forget. The Italian families whose members fled to Brazil lived in a different kind of exile. They remained in Italy, subject to surveillance and social stigma, while their fugitive relatives tried to disappear across an ocean. Some maintained contact through intermediaries, brief conversations that couldn't be traced. Others severed ties completely, understanding that association with fugitives made their own lives impossible. When arrests finally came, these families faced conflicting emotions: relief that years of uncertainty were over, fear about impending prosecutions, grief for time lost that could never be recovered. The fugitives' choices didn't just affect their own lives, they reverberated through generations, creating wounds that arrests and prosecutions couldn't heal. October 23, 1972, São Paulo. Tommaso Buscetta arrested as part of an international heroin trafficking crackdown, loyal to Cosa Nostra, refusing to cooperate. October 23, 1983, Rio de Janeiro. The same man arrested 11 years later at his villa in Alto da Boa Vista, now Roberto Cavalcanti, his family murdered by the Corleonesi during the Second Mafia War, facing the decision that would make him the most famous pentito in Mafia history. August 20th, 2015, Recife. Pasquale Scotti arrested after 29 years as Francisco de Castro. His Brazilian life revealed as elaborate deception, fighting extradition through March 2016. May 24th, 2021. João Pessoa. Rocco Morabito captured in a hotel room alongside Vincenzo Pasquino after escaping Uruguayan prison and spending decades coordinating cocaine trafficking from South America. Each arrest was an ending, the collapse of carefully constructed lies, the moment when geography's protection finally failed. And in each case, the fundamental truth remained unchanged. Brazil had offered temporary sanctuary, but the past never stops pursuing those who run from it. In organized crime, exile is just another form of prison. The walls are invisible, the cells encompass continents, but the sentence is the same. You can cross oceans, change your name, build new lives. But eventually, someone finds you. And when they do, all the distance you've traveled collapses into the moment of recognition, when your false face is stripped away and the person you were trying to leave behind is all that remains.